Who's heard of no child opinion? Good, okay. Very, very controversial. Some people absolutely can't stand this. It's the work of the devil, some argue. And some say it's the work of President Bush, the second President Bush. And people equate that. When most of the bill that became law was developed during the Clinton administration. Senator Kennedy had his fingerprints all over this law, but it became so controversial, okay, because of all this testing, all these demands that the feds are going to make on local schools, which is relatively new, is that this is a way to keep some people down. This is a way to keep suppressing the achievement of some, because we're just going to keep publishing and publishing and publishing these test scores. And that's a bad thing. Okay? Well, what if we took a different spin on that? And the different spin that some of us take is that if you take a local school, okay? Ithaca High School, all right? Or the Ithaca City School District as a whole, with its 8 elementary schools, its 2 middle schools, its alternative high school, and a regular high school. And you take a real-life school district, okay? And you look at their average test scores, average, the annual graduation rate back in the early 2000s, 1999, 2000, 2001, before NCLB really took off, okay? And what you see is a school district that looks unbelievably great on paper. It looks really good. You've got a pretty high average graduation rate, meaning of all the students, what proportion of the senior class graduated. You've got a pretty good number there. 8th grade test scores, 3rd grade test scores. Back then, they're just 4th and 4th grade test scores. They look pretty good on the average. And what the federal government did with NCLB, and you can love it or you can hate it, you can criticize President Clinton or President Bush, or you want to blame for this law, what they required was that we break out these scores by race, break out the scores by special education status, and break out the scores by socioeconomic status, meaning poor kids versus non-poor kids. It's if you qualify for free reduced price lunch, you're considered poor. This is kind of a crude indicator, but it's used very commonly, very widely. And so the feds are making us do this, making every single school district in the country report their test scores broken out by these different categories. And what you see when you do that is the achievement gap, plain and simple. Not hard, you cannot hide it. If you looked at the school report cards, okay, for Ithaca in 1999, which you have the test scores, so now broken up by race, not broken up by gender, just has those test scores. Looks pretty good. Then you contrast that with the post-NCLB report cards, where per federal law, you need to break these out by race and by social class, and you see these very, very large achievement gaps and very disturbing achievement gaps. So what does that do? It puts pressure on the community to stand up and say, this isn't right. This district isn't as good as we thought it was. What's going on here? We thought all these kids went off to college. We thought 60 kids go into Cornell every year. We thought another 60 kids go into other Ivy League colleges every year. We thought our school was great. We thought our district was great. Well, the trick is that's 120 kids out of a graduating class of 350. And when you really look at the achievement levels of these groups of kids, you see these incredibly big disparities. Okay? For example, and I'll come back to where I got these numbers from in just a second. But for example, if you are a minority student, which we defined as being African American, Hispanic, or Native American, okay, and attending the Ithaca City School District, whether it's your 3rd grade test score, your 4th grade test score, 5th grade test score, on average, it bounces a little bit year to year, okay, you're about 12 points below an average Asian kid or an average white kid. It's about a 12-point gap on these exams. And the exams are, it's a quirky scoring rubric, but it's a 200-point exam, so 12 points is roughly 6 points on a regular 100-point exam. All right? So you got a 6-point exam, a 6-point differential, 6-point gap if you're a minority. Okay? If you're poor, it's about a 14-point gap. All right? So if you're poor and white, in contrast to non-poor and white, it's about a 14-point gap. If you're poor and black, or poor and Hispanic, you add those together. through the methodology we're using. And so very quickly you get these really enormous gaps. Okay? And so let me tell you the very local story. I'm guessing this was 7, 8 years ago, something around there. A school board member was taking my course. For whatever reason, he had some time and wanted to take my course. And I said, great, come on in. Through the guy who was taking my course, I met another member of the school board who kept hearing about these issues we were talking about in my class. And so I met the guy down at Ithaca Bagels one day, down on Route 13 there. And he wanted to have a conversation about why it is that some kids in Ithaca don't do very well, and other kids do really well. And he said, tell me about this, I don't get it. We have all these resources, we spend all this money, but we always thought the school district was great. What's the deal? So I explained to him, and if you want to get more detail on this, we can talk a little bit later on, or certainly there's a number of courses on campus that give you much more detail as to why this achievement gap exists. But I began to give him the different arguments and explanations for why some kids do better than others. And this is the guiding theme of the course I teach, is that why is it that some groups of kids just do better in school than others? And some say, what kind of measure are you talking about? I said, I don't care. Graduation rate, dropout rate, third grade test score, high school English exam, I don't care what it is. The gap is almost always there. Okay? I don't get caught up in the specific measures because the gap is consistent across these measures. So the guy was asking, what's going on? So I told him, I gave him a bunch of different reasons, as I best understand it. All right? And he said, I've got an idea. He said, let's create, to the best of his knowledge, and I'd never heard of it, never thought about the idea before, an equity report card. This was right at the time, and this is before you all came to campus here, that because of these, mainly because this guy on the Board of Education, the board adopted a new goal. All boards of education have goals. All kids can learn, and we're going to make a great welcoming environment for our kids and give them wonderful experiences. You see these board goals all over the country. His goal was a bit different. He says the goal of the Ithaca City School District should be to eliminate the difference in achievement, difference in success, I think was the word they used, based on race, based on wealth. Okay? Let's get rid of it. Let's make it a board goal that we refer to all the time, we see all the time. Let's put on these little business card things that had the 5 different board goals, and a number one on there was we were going to eliminate this goal. And he said, let's work on doing this. But the first step is this equity report card. So we said, can we do this? I said, I don't know, you're on the board. Maybe we can. And so we began meeting with the data people. Okay, the data people that were out there down in Boynton Middle School, there's a whole data office down there. And I began asking questions, and we began having meetings. There were a couple of board members, there were a couple of teachers, a couple of principals, and a couple of community leaders. And so we met monthly for about a year. And every month we'd show up, and I was always scrambling and pulling an all-nighter before these meetings, because I was in charge of analyzing the data and bringing the data. And what my goal was at the time was, let's examine this data in many, many, many different ways. And every month I'm going to display it in a different way. And after a while, we'll get some sense of how we want to really portray this to the community. Because this guy's goal, Jeff's goal, was to put this right in front of the community's face and say, Ithaca, you argue you're the most enlightened community in the country. You argue you're very liberal, left-leaning, and all the rest, and that we care about all kids. Let's put this data right in front. Not much different from the NCLB, not much different from the feds. And that's why I went back and talked about the feds a little while ago. Highlighting these differences will then bring pressure to bear on the school district to do something about these gaps. And if you measure these every year, and if every year this report card comes out showing the achievement gap, if the gap doesn't change, put more pressure on the district. If the gap gets smaller, you can praise the district. If the gap gets bigger, you imagine the result. Okay? So we began to work on this. And we spent about a year. We spent a lot of time on this, portraying the data in many, many different ways. That's where some of these numbers come from. The 12-point gap if you're black. And actually, I think there's about an 18-point gap if you're poor. And you put those together, if you're poor and black or poor and Hispanic, you're about 30 points down from a non-poor white or a non-poor Asian student. And so that's where those numbers came from. We looked at building by building differences. We looked at